All right, we back. New day, new video, new react. And honestly, I had a viewer come in and say that he learned a lot more from analyzing code, especially Pirate Software's code, than any tutorial online. So you know what? I like that idea. I like that idea a lot. Mm, trying to figure out though why my sound's going through there. HDMI, right? Hold on. New Linux system, who dis?
DRM analysis for Python.
But it's still working. Video card's still going through. Oh, wait, hold up. Wait. I ain't got the right auxiliary port. Let me check.
Pirate Software's two.
All right, that works. So, I really like this analysis. I watched a little bit because I kind of wanted to go through the details on stream, right? So this is from Slop News Network. Cool name. Cool name. Because there's a lot of slop. So much slop all over the world now. I mean, we can kind of call it AI slop, really. You seen that ape, that really stupid gorilla ape thing going through like the back rooms or like pretending he's filming? Oh, the Sasquatch, the ape, it just keeps changing. Like the AI can't figure out what the standard look for this character is. So every like 15 seconds that it generates some sort of scene, that ape looks different. And there was this backrooms one. Total slop. Yes, I'm guilty of watching slop sometimes. I just want something completely pointless, if you will. Um, but it was interesting because in order to fit this AI generated process to make it less sloppy, he had to like every time the scene changed, he had to go boom, morphed again. I'm morphing so I can stay hidden. But really it's the AI generator not capable of maintaining the same character design. So that's the interesting part. There's gonna be so much AI slop nowadays. You see a lot of commercials with AI slop. Anyway, that's not really the focus here. I can tangent on a lot of subjects all the time, every day. But the subject is back to pirate software. And we're going to learn about DRM. DRM, I forget what it stands for, but in the end, DRM are ways, and kind of started with media uh, for anti-piracy. But DRM basically was a case for kind of locking down content so that people, okay, digital rights management. So there was some sort of like encryption or some sort of process that would have to prove ownership in some form or fashion. And I believe DRM, the first time I remember hearing it was like on DVDs, on PlayStation games, so they couldn't get burnt off. The DRM between a PlayStation CD drive being able to read specific cases for a CD. DRM has existed for a while, but now it's kind of evolved to this like online mentality where DRM is kind of like lazy. Like back in the day, we used to have like a key. We would use a key. You buy the box. The physical box had a nice little key on it. You put the key in, boom, you have it. You own it. You can reuse the key. But because it's an algorithm that can be cracked eventually, especially under the case of using assembly language or disassembling the process, you can really directly think, what the heck is this? I just dropped some random text on my desk. Nice. Um, you can basically crack it. That's why keygens existed and have been existing for a lot of older games. So it wasn't the sure way to do it, but it was still effective, and there was plenty of like money to be made from just having a key. But now DRM is managed by kind of like your app stores, but your Steam shops, your EA clients, your give me another couple of thousand examples. Everyone in the Blizzard client, what used to be Battle.net is now Blizzard Network or whatever. Basically, in order to prove you have ownership of something, you make an account on these little applications that manage your apps, your games for you. And in order for them to run, they have to be connected to the internet so that every time you run the game, they have to verify that it's legitimately purchased, which is great, for one case scenario, it's totally fine. But for another case scenario, what happens when that server doesn't get supported anymore? This is where, well, basically Stop Killing Games comes in. The movement in the EU to basically hold companies accountable and give them a little bit of a nudge to make a end of life plan for their product. The product they're selling people. And the problem is, as soon as that server goes down, because you've got a majority of people involved already bought the game, there's no more income, right? Everyone's bought the game. Cool. You've paid off your CEOs, your developers, and all that. Now you got costs. You've got servers to pay, Amazon servers or whatever the heck they use, depending on. And those costs are over time. They never go away. And if there's no income, how do you manage those, right? So DRM in that case scenario, that means that if you break the server, if you close it down because there's no money involved, then your game stops working. That's a little bit extreme. So DRM can be a very interesting subject, but this is an interesting one because Mr. Pirate here, I'm gonna call him the fake pirate, because he really does seem like he does actually state he has worked for Blizzard. Maybe not under Blizzard, but you'll see here he does state this. And then he states he's a hacker. But then the way he perceives the code and the way he basically creates a perfect DRM software that can't be broken can be easily broken with just flipping one of his stupid zeros to a one or one to a zero. Like his mentality is so primitive that I don't even think he understands how bad his code is. I legitimately think he thinks his code is completely infallible. But when other people start analyzing it, and this is where we jump in too, we start to analyze the code, especially that he has through our little Slop network guy. Actually, I'm gonna subscribe to this guy. He's super cool. I definitely suggest that. I'll leave the link in the description after the video, after the stream. But Slop News Network, I was impressed by how much computer tech he knows. And he's not like a super developer either. I mean, I can't remember what he did exactly professionally, but he went enough to go to a disassembler, take apart the program and match the code. So let's take a look. Let's take a look.
Two games, Champions of Breakfast and Heartbound. Let's start with some information about the two games and clear up some misinfo too. Both Champions of Breakfast and Heartbound were created in the Game Maker engine. Champions of Breakfast is the game Jason claims has the unpiratable DRM.
I tried to find a way so that our game wouldn't get pirated because it'd be easy to pirate it. This is your save file. First start the game up, it actually checks what achievements you have and it unlocks powers based on your achievements. This is actually the save file for the character, so you can't pirate it because you can never use the achievements. It made it unpiratable, which is deeply hilarious.
So, as you saw, essentially the DRM for
That's
Champions
what
of
he
Breakfast
thinks.
is
He
the Steam
feels like
Achievements.
he thinks he's so clever. Like, I like the idea, to be honest. But then when you realize you can basically spoof Steam, spoof achievements, and all these other formats, you can still do it. It's still doable. So it's not foolproof. It's not perfect at all. Nothing ever is, really. But the goal is to kind of make it as difficult to break as possible, and you'll see it's actually really easy.
Acting as a quasi save file. The Heartbound DRM is the following code snippet that Jason has shown live on stream multiple times. Now, recently, a lot of people have been posting that
We've seen this snippet, at least not this one particular, but we're going to analyze some of his other snippets as well that we've done in the last stream.
Heartbound has always online DRM. That is false. Heartbound does not have always online DRM. The DRM approach does not require online connectivity to function. It'll work just fine with Steam in offline mode. Jason has told the truth in regards to this matter, so he doesn't deserve the online DRM hate he's getting currently. Second,
fair.
the Steam achievements acting as a save file is only in Champions of Breakfast. Heartbound does not have any dependence on Steam achievements. These are two completely separate DRM solutions. Now, let's start analyzing the Heartbound DRM code. The important variable we need to pay attention to within the code is on line 3, the global.pirated game variable that is set to 1. Like the
Oh my God, look at that alarm zero again. Maybe these are global variables in some form or another. Maybe this is a game maker thing. Alarm zero, alarm one. I'm sure there's a better way to do it though. It still seems like there's room for They do it this way generically so that you could potentially customize a layer above the default organization of GameMaker so that you have the freedom to basically custom organize your game. They're not going to force you into anything specific with forced variable names, right? So here he's got pirated game. That's probably his own little global. Yeah, this is his own little system here. Pirated games is a global, personal, custom variable. Steam achievements, Steam screenshots, so on and so forth. I hate the fact that he keeps using zeros and ones, man. Just use a true or false. Are you that lazy to type in 4 characters instead of one? And this is actually what you're gonna see. And he didn't do a good job of obfuscating some of his details. So because he uses such basic terminology and variable control, if he uses true or false, it's much different encoding than it is a one or a zero. And that string that you're gonna see, the IgG games, is so obviously unique. He didn't try to make some sort of like adjusted binary like change, right? Normally you can encode this with a binary signature or a hexadecimal signature, so it's not visible as a string, which helps you obfuscate some details. But you'll see that's basically how you identify some very specific code. Not to mention, he didn't protect this part of his code from being altered. You can easily delete this section from a disassembler and then run the game like normal. There's no check to make sure that this part of the code is actually working or not. It's so weird. It's so absolutely like lame. Like it's so basic that it shows it wasn't thought out correctly. Just the fact that I, as a person, can disassemble this and remove this whole section with the pirated game, or just flip pirated game to zero and then remove the if statements and done. Resave the new file and boom. And then create a little patch for it or modification for it. It is just so easy to basically go around that. You know that he's trying, for sure he's trying, but he's not thinking of all the possible cases. So when you're a hacker, that's the thing. When you think like a hacker, and I'm not going to claim to be a hacker or anything, but I do think creatively. And that's kind of the difference between a regular office programmer that's kind of stuck on programming their own little section of a program in a company where they got to maintain a specific part of a library, some classes or something, and then write a documentation and pass it over to the rest of the team so they know how to use that part of that object. You're kind of stuck in one little window in the office. But when you start expanding your horizons, you start to see how a whole game works, not just a specific object or class. And a hacker is what I consider a creative thinker. It's not just a logical thinker on how, how to put together a piece of code, but how to do things in a way that would be unreal, unthinkable to regular programmers. Like, oh wow, I didn't realize you can do that, or I didn't know you can basically change the pointer to one location in memory and then have that memory be an index for a bunch of other pointers, and then basically separate your virus into multiple little locations that basically hide itself from a signature scanner like AVG or Kaspersky or whatever, because you'd have to understand where the index is and then catch all those other locations. Like there's so many creative ways. Polymorphism. Polymorphism is a creative software factor that changes the way the code is or is perceived, that in a way you're not using your typical coding like this, like the zeros and ones hard coded formats. Everything's a variable and everything keeps switching. Even the memory locations keep switching. So there's a lot of like creative thinking when it comes to like hacker thought, but the way he codes is absolutely opposite of. So anyway, that's my little rant on that.
Variable name suggests this is what dictates whether or not the game is considered pirated within the game itself. A value of 1 implies the variable has a truthy value. Normally for this type of thing would use a boolean.
Hey Ferio, good to see you. Thanks for coming in for the first time ever. Good to see you. Loving my streams. I don't think I've seen you before, but I appreciate you coming here. No thanks. Please don't solicit on my page. You're free to chat and have a conversation if you'd like about the subject, but no soliciting, no money related stuff. I'm gonna start thinking about banning any sort of money based posts in the future. Anyway, keep going.
and use true and false as the variable values directly, but we'll leave that
Hmm.
aside for now and touch on it again in the code review section. If we continue and move on to line 5, we can see the DRM process goes as follows. First, we check to see if Steam is initialized. Once if it's confirmed to be true, the game is considered legitimate, hence line 7. Then at line 13, we check to see if the Steam client is actually a Steam emulation or crack. The double equal sign means we're checking to see if the value of this function is equal to the ASCII string IGG Games. IGG Games is an unsafe piracy group, and they use their name when they package their cracked Steam games. Then we set the game to pirated on line 14 if we confirm.
Like in this case scenario, you will have a way for yourself to check not if equals IGG Games, being that IGG Games is like the particular hacked version of Steam, because they have like some weird clients that basically let you bypass all kinds of things. The key here is that you would check if not equal Steam. That's it. If not equals Steam, which means anything. It can be IGG Games, it can be whatever other possible string, but Steam has its own unique identifier, and that's when you can actually patch a global case scenario where you're not just looking at, hey, is this from IGG Games? Because there might be another client you're not aware of. But this check is so hard coded and equal IGG Games that just specifically talks about this one case scenario. What about every other case scenario? That's why you use the inverted logic. This is reasoning. This is computer logic, logic and organization and computer science classes up in university. Instead of identifying one possible IGG game string, you would do a not equals whatever the string for Steam is, which would basically say, hey, if our persona name is not Steam, that means it's something else. That means, you know, it's not legit. And that's how you can check for not just one case scenario. You can check for every case scenario. That will include IGG games is not equal to Steam. So that would be a pirated game equals one. So that's just the logical inference of having like a really direct intention, but then not thinking about all the other possible case scenarios. Again, IGG games is just one case of a string match. But there might be 5 other clients we're not including, which we could if we just kept copying and pasting the same if statement. But the best case scenario is just identify what the persona name for Steam is. I think it's probably Steam Games, something similar. And then say if not equal Steam Games. And that's it. Then it's pirated. So then you're covering every single possible string within that range without having to basically explicitly say IGG games, some other games, this other game, this other emulator, etc. That's the logic that makes the difference between a linear mind, a person that cannot or that thinks so uncreatively that they're thinking about the exact thing and they're coding that exact thing, versus a person that thinks about a bigger picture involving other case scenarios. This is one case scenario he thought of. Oh, what if it's IGG games? That's the only one I'm familiar with. But what if there's others? What if a new one pops up you don't know about? That's why you just say a not equal to Steam will basically catch every other case scenario. That's it.
It's an IGG Games crack copy of the game. Now, we move on to line 16 where we check to see if there's a bogus account ID. We also, on line 19, check to
This one is different. The Steam get user account ID equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Sure, a bogus ID would make sense of this case, but it's hard to really determine unless you know a particular algorithm that Steam uses to create their accounts. This would be one case, but what if it's 876543221? You'd miss that particular bogus ID. You know, like 5555555, right? So there is a kind of like, yeah, you got one of all possible case scenarios. It's like basically password 123. That's basically what we're looking at, except user ID. So I would say it's much more difficult to create a number-based account ID filter unless you specifically know what the equation is or the algorithm that creates a new user on the Steam ID. Or there is a place where you can scan, which you could do potentially with the Steam API, scan the existing user IDs, all of the user IDs, and then verify that it's not one of the millions of user IDs. That would be, well, you wouldn't scan it. You'd send it to Steam, and Steam would do the scan for you and just return a true or false. I guess that's the real case scenario, right? You wouldn't expose your, uh, Steam would not expose its user account IDs to you, but they can run a internal API function on their server that says, hey, give me an ID and I'll check to see if it exists and give you a true if it exists. That's another way. But then that would be kind of like really intertwining the API for Steam in your game. So if the Steam servers don't work, then it becomes a DRM connected DRM check, right? Because if the Steam servers don't work, you cannot verify that account number because you're depending on the API to connect back to you. So then if your Steam doesn't work, then your game doesn't start, and that's where the issue is, where the um, Stop Killing Games campaign really kind of works its way in. Like they can find different ways to do a DRM connection check without having to basically nuke your game if Steam dies. That's kind of like my biggest worry is that what happens when Steam just dies? Maybe it's down for a couple of weeks. I know some games are going to work fine because they're not all DRM connected online, but I also know that there's going to be a lot of them that are depending on this sort of user account check before the game even starts. Now, maybe they can do it once a month. Maybe you launch it every month and once a month it checks and it verifies. Which honestly, if you verify it once, twice, three times, four times, you don't have to keep doing it over and over. You basically just say, hey, he's been playing the same version that's been downloaded from Steam. You can verify that. The Steam API can verify that, verify. And then from there, it can say, all right, well, why do I have to keep checking when I know this computer ID connected to this account has been verified 20 times? He's got a legit copy. Copy. The end. End of story. The DRM can kind of have a lifespan just to double check and make sure. And then at some point, it just kind of turns itself off. But then that would be an exploit because maybe you can change the computer time. If you change the computer time based on a certain value and it's not synchronized automatically online, then you can basically just move your game or your computer 3, 4 months forward, or let's say 10 times of a check for 10 months, move your computer time 10 months forward, pretend the check has happened, it unlocks the game from DRM, then you just go back to your current time and now you have your own little unlocked game. So there are so many ways to bypass DRMs. It's really difficult to make like a foolproof case.
To see if we have a known Steam app ID that is commonly used in cracks or playing pirated games or mods. If either one of these checks end up being true, we also set the pirated game variable to true. Now, in order for us to break this DRM, the first two problems we have to deal with is the function call of Steam initialized and the Steam DRM that would be included with the actual game. Steam DRM is Steam's own added-on DRM. It is completely separate from the Heartbound DRM we're discussing. Due to legal reasons, I'm not going to directly show what programs to use or how to bypass Steam functions in Steam DRM, but I'll explain a bit about the process and how secure using Steam functions as a form of DRM is. First, let's talk about the Steam DRM. The Steam DRM has been well understood by cracking groups for a very long time. It's so well understood and commonly cracked, there are multiple tool sets built for it and guides, to the point even non-technical users can use them to crack and distribute their own Steam games. This is called home riffs, and this is one of the reasons there's so many Steam games that have day one cracks floating around. Next, we have the Steam functions that we saw in the Heartbound DRM code that we need to address for the Champions of Breakfast DRM. For this issue, let's talk about Steam client emulators. These are programs that mimic some legitimate Steam client functions and fake some of the other functionality you expect.
Basically, spoofers. They connect or they create a local server. They have a host file modification where you say that you go to steam.com. I don't know if you guys know what host is, but host is a specific file on the computer, both for Windows, Linux, anything. It's kind of like your DNS main chart. You can modify this, so if you type in google.com, it actually takes you to a totally different website. This is how viruses also take over your computer. By you typing google.com, it takes you to a website that looks like Google, acts like Google, but is totally a virus. So that file, if ever impacted, which is a system file, and should never be modified unless you have like an antivirus or something that basically keeps it safe. But you can basically say, hey, steam.com and then 127001 on port 85 or whatever, or 850. And what that would do is every time the whole computer tries to connect to Steam or the Steam online API, it's going to connect to a local server you created. And then this application that would be essentially a Steam spoofer would pretend to be Steam, verify all the details, you can set it up on the back end and say, hey, I have every single achievement ever. And that's it. Like it just kind of points to you. It never actually connects to Steam. So these kind of proxies, these host files will be your first point of direction. And you can change the values in there and you can like basically fool Steam into thinking it's connecting.
in the legitimate Steam client. There are numerous Steam client emulators, and I'm not
Also, I see a bunch of people in here. Like, subscribe, guys, for more content like
not
this.
going to touch any of these emulators, but take my word for it that they can easily get through the Steam DRM and the initialized function check. And they can also mimic the Steam Achievement API, meaning not only can the Steam DRM be bypassed by using these emulators, but they
You
would
can also
also
use
allow you to
the
crack and play Champions of
achievements.
Breakfast, plus you'd basically have a save game editor along with the two. While we're on the topic of Champions of Breakfast, I was curious how long it took for the game with the unpiratable DRM to be cracked after it was released, and this is what I found. 1 day and 17 hours after the game was released on Steam, there was already a home rip floating around. If you don't consider home rips to be valid,
You'll see how this guy actually disassembles the game and cracks it in like 30 seconds. It's so simple. If you just know a little bit about the basics of assembly. You don't even have to know assembly to the fullest extent. You just know how to change a 1 to a 0. Can you do that? Can you do that? Yeah, yeah. Like and subscribe,
I
guys.
also checked to see if any known where scene groups had a crack for the game. The scene group Simplex has also had a crack for the game floating around for years at this point, so that unpiratable DRM has been soundly defeated multiple times just after launch. Now, with those problems addressed, let's return to the Heartbound DRM code and examine the last problem we need to figure out how to break, namely the IgG games check and the various ID checks setting the pirated game variable to true. In order to break this, we'll need to do some reverse engineering. To make this reverse engineering and cracking process smooth,
Also, keep in mind this string, these two quotes in yellow that you see for IGGG or GG games, this is the worst possible method to hide what your intentions are. I've seen viruses that attempt to connect to my computer obfuscate the actual URL website that they're connecting to by putting it in an array and then shifting each array by a single bit character. And then when they want to use that URL, they have to create a whole algorithm to unencrypt the string so it brings it back to the URL that it takes you to during live processing. Because if you leave a string like this, it's searchable. It's searchable with control find. That's it. So when you actually have a string that doesn't morph itself or change in any way with any algorithmic Caesar cipher, even a basic Caesar cipher, guys, anything simple, it basically becomes an easy search, and that's how actually he finds this code in like 5 seconds.
smoother to explain, I've copied over this snippet of code into a tiny C++ program. The DRM I have in it is in the left pane between lines 13 to 51. Now, you might notice I have a couple functions here between lines 15 to 33. Those are just placeholders. Due to legal reasons, I'm not including the real Steam SDK or functions in my tiny program, or including it within the actual reverse engineering process. Since I already explained
So those are similar formats. Character, get, stream, personal name, IgG games. Guys, this is independent functions that replicate the same thing. Yeah, those are just replicated. I mean, this is just a lot of
how
extra,
they can
but
be defeated, it's not important to include them in the program. Back to our code, you can see the rest of the DRM matches up basically one-to-one with the DRM snippet we have from Heartbound. Last line to note, I run the DRM check here on line 108 just after the program starts. The rest of my program code doesn't matter too much. I'm basically just using the Windows native Win32 API to create a simple window that will have a red background if the game is pirated, and if it's a legitimate copy, the background will be green. Also, just like the Heartbound DRM code, we start the program assuming to be in a pirated state. Now, I compiled the little app we have, and we have an exe we can run. Let's pretend we don't have the actual source code and just have the exe. So how do we modify this exe and beat the DRM?
so basically he created a mini application. He can't legally practice live, so he basically replicated that code in which is being used as a DRM protection because this is what 62 kilobytes. That's not the game, right? So he's testing out that snippet of code to see if it's doable, if it's capable of basically being exploited. But in the case scenario that, you use the main application and you control find the IgG games, you'll find that it's the same process to crack both. So he can't really show the actual game getting cracked because Michael skipped a little bit. But in the general sense, he's showing the same exact method, the same process to actually crack both.
In order to modify the exe, we'll need to use what is known as a disassembler plus a debugger. I'll be using Ollie Debug, which is a very old and outdated x86 debugger. If someone was doing
Ollie Debug, Ada, Gindra, those are basically ways to change your typical program from executable. Um, there's a little process to go through. I don't know if I want to go into crazy detail, but it goes like this. You make code, you take that code, which is human readable, you compile it. Compiling means translating for machine language, where the machine now can read it. Because between the way we code and the works, there's a huge translation process, right? It's not just that it reads the code we make. We speak more human-esque in the logic that compiles to machine learning, which is called machine language, which is called assembly. And every single program goes down to assembly. C, Java, well, Java goes to bytecode, so that's a little different. C, C sharp, Ruby, I believe, basically anything that compiles. And then we can disassemble it, not to C, not to the original language that it was spoken, but to the assembly version where we can actually see what the code is doing in a language that's not really like zeros and ones binary. Because if you stare at a giant screen of zeros or ones, it's not going to do anything. So OllyDB is one of those disassemblers that takes any exe file and shows you basically what's happening in the backend. And what's happening is like information moving between the RAM, the processor, the individual registers that are in the processor. There's a lot of like kind of super computery things. It's less human language and way more computery.
Doing actual reverse engineering these days, the tools they would look for and use would probably be something like EDA Pro or Ghidra, a reverse engineering tool built by the NSA and freely available on GitHub to download and use. Anyways, let's open up Ollie Debug and attach a little DRM test application and see what we get. So here in the main window, we have something that is called assembly. This is
There it
normally
is.
the lowest low-level programming language
And we can do this in the future too when we get to assembly. I don't know too much about a disassembly or assembly language, but I can kind of read the bits and pieces. Moving stuff from one place to another basically can be a mathematical incentive, adding numbers, adding values, saving values, but it's all based on understanding the processor too. Specific processors have different registers. So it's also very specific to, do you have a 32-bit processor, a 64, Intel, AMD, all of those will have all kinds of different assemblers.
used and is very tightly corresponds to machine code. And these are the instructions your computer or phone CPU is actually executing when you're using a program. The other window panes don't matter at all for our purposes, so we can ignore them. Next, I'm going to run this program as just a simple smoke test to make sure everything's working as we expect it to. Namely, we see the red background and the pirate game detected stuff we expect from our DM. I don't need the live attached process info, so I'll close the app and return to the view we had originally when we opened the exe. Now, remember earlier how I mentioned IgG games was an ASCII string? Well, that's what we're going to search for. Since the string isn't obfuscated and will be in plain text, we can easily search for it and hunt it down. All right, I see 2 IgG game strings in our search. Let's just go and open the first one and see what code is there.
So look at this, right? MOV is for moving one value from some registry to another registry. Depending on the movement, it could be addition, it could be multiplication, subtraction, and so forth. Push is creating a stack of memory. Pop is retrieving a stack from memory, returning. I mean, basically, if you can take a look at this and compare it to any other language, it's very linear. And a function would basically have a return, a jump value, and a return value. So a function would basically have these sort of indications where you're going to, let's say, 002F160E, that's the line that it begins in, and then it ends in 002F1617. So you would tell for a function, you would tell the assembly language, jump to this memory location, and then go do the values necessary, and then return the process of whatever is happening. So that's basically how we go to functions. We don't even use function names within the assembly language. This is where it gets very, very tedious.
The first function looks similar to our stub function in our C++ code. The second IgG game strings is just a bit beneath, so let's look at that. Now we see something interesting, notably the D-word pointer and the line ending with 0. If we look just a few more lines below, we see more D-word pointer lines.
So this is basically where it's giving out that particular set of if statements right here. These are the if statements that are checking for DRM protection. Very hard to really try and compare because there's a bunch of like D-word pointer, DG, whatever. It just doesn't look like you would normally see a code, especially if you're just starting coding. This looks like gobbledygook. But if you can change a 1 to a 0,
Except these ones end with 1.
by even to the case of finding a specific pattern, we saw there were 4 if statements, and here's basically 4 similar lines or maybe 4 lines each of code. that you can kind of see they're very similar except a couple of small differences. So if you notice this little detail, you can flip that 0 to a 1 just to test it.
I hope everyone is catching on and you realize these are the lines of our original C++
See, there it is. Well, kind of. Okay, so those three at the bottom look similar. The top one, JE short heart bow, JE short move D word pointer. Yeah, they're all basically the same type looking. I don't see any crazy differences here.
source code, setting the pirated game variable. Now, since we already know this is the DRM function, what happens if we change the values in those lines below to 0? With all that changed, let's try running our little application again, and we've successfully cracked the DRM, since now the pirated game variable at every point in our program code will always report back false.
So basically, you just flip the strings to the numbers, right? This is also probably an issue with using integers instead of Booleans, because it might be much easier to identify if you use these simple integer values for true or false. Another situation where he should start using true and false instead of constantly depending on zeros and ones because he's probably too lazy to write 4 letters instead of one number. It's a security risk, like I said in the last stream.
Now, I'm sure many of you watching have questions and concerns. Stuff like, what if Pirate never shared the DRM code? You wouldn't be able to do this so easily and quickly. Or maybe something like,
That's
your
a
app
fair
was made in
statement.
C++. Heartbound is made in GameMaker, so the output files and structure would be different. First,
Not
let's
really.
pretend we didn't know what the DRM code looked like, and we're doing a real blind reverse engineering attempt at cracking the DRM. Let's go through this scenario. Let's assume we already have the original game files. Now we open the game, and let's say we're using one of those Steam client emulators I mentioned from earlier in the video. Let's say we're playing through Heartbound and trying to find information to use to actually crack it. Well, we're in luck. Since Heartbound has a piracy message, if you somehow manage to pull this exact scenario I'm describing, here's a screenshot from a user that owns a legitimate copy of.
You can actually run the assembler and the code as the game is running. And when you appear to this particular case, this yard shall not appear. That's so lame. When this little screen appears, it triggers a stop in the assembler. And then you can go back in memory and see what triggered it. So there's a couple of ways you can go around this. You can create a timer that takes maybe 10, 15, 20 seconds after it checks those DRM sequences, and then it'd be a little bit harder to figure out where in the code it happened. But as soon as you run the assembled game through the assembler as a attachment, assembler basically waits there and just shows you all the code that's running. And as soon as you see this, you press that pause button, and then you can see where it came from. So technically, not that hard to actually identify what affected this
The
screen.
game, and they managed to trigger this pirate message on their Steam Deck, meaning two things. One, the DRM is so bad it has false positive activations, which I find funny. And two, we have our unique identifiable, mostly unobfuscated ASCII string to
Like if this game took like a couple of years to make, I'm sorry, man. I haven't even heard of it, and it looks really poorly made.
search for in our debugger. The pirate message string is unique enough that we can use it to hunt down the DRM code within the debugger. The reason being, in order for the message to appear, it has to either be checking the pirated game variable or is close to the DRM check function, because otherwise it wouldn't be able to be triggered. In either case, we have enough info from this alone to hunt down the DRM and break it, even if we didn't have the original DRM code snippet for reference. Now,
Because the code would activate at that location, we pause it, we take a look at the assembler, whoop, there it is, it did a check, and then you go ahead and identify the pieces of code like before, even though if it's not a string.
Now, let's talk about the C++ versus GameMaker issue. GameMaker is a game engine, and it has its own process of packaging up a game built together and will include much more files than just a single exe. You might think this would make the cracking process more difficult, but the exact opposite is actually true. The reason is GameMaker builds are something that is well understood, and there are lots of decompilation tools. You might remember me using the term compilation earlier in the video, so let me explain these two terms a bit more clearly now. When you have, for example, our C++ source code and you're trying to turn it into an executable the computer can run, this is called compilation. The process
And there's your kind of midpoint. C++ code, human readable. If this, then that, while this, variable here. Basically terminology that we can use as a human being so it can make some sense when we're coding. Then you pass it through a compiler. Here they show Visual Studio, but you can basically use GCC, which is a GNOME compiler for Linux-based. I can basically pull that up too. I think it's built into most Linux systems. Input file. So if I make a C application in a text file, I can use GCC, put the file in, and then basically compile it using this format. And then it spits out a compiled exe. And that's really just where the machine Language is the code that the machine uses, which is basically assembly.
Process of turning code into instructions the computer can actually understand and can execute. Decompilation is the process in reverse. You have some kind of application and you're trying to convert it back into what the original source code looked like, meaning you can use a decomp tool on the GameMaker build and get back GameMaker language code that it looks somewhat close to the original source code, which also means you'd have an easier time hunting down the DRM code since it's easier to reason about in a GameMaker language than it is in raw assembly. So the C++ reverse engineering example I demonstrated is actually harder and more worst case scenario, relatively speaking, to trying and figure out the crack.
So, because GameMaker is universally used and they have a very set standard set of processes that every game follows, it's easier to decrypt and assemble those standards into actual code versus C and C++ as a general vanilla, because you can basically do whatever you want with C and C++. You can totally not abide by any rules. You can create your own processes, your own ideas. So that's why it's more difficult. You have much more diverse dynamics in just a regular, simple, vanilla C++. But Game Maker is so specific and its libraries are so well known that you can identify certain patterns in the code and say, oh, this is this type of function. So it's much easier to reverse engineer Game Maker versus just a vanilla, pure C++ code. That's basically it.
Now, to the last question everyone might have, what if that pirated game variable didn't exist and you couldn't change the value to 0? Well, nothing changes even if that was the case. Why?
Yeah,
Well,
this
the
is the
DRM
thing.
is so stupidly simple and there isn't any application security measures to prevent reverse engineering.
Application security measures. If this function does not exist, break the game. If my little check for DRM doesn't run, something's wrong. The original code has been tampered with. Break the game. There is always a level of external keeping track where it says, hey, is my like an integrity check, right? Is my code looking like this? Like another program that looks at the exe and says, hey, this is what it should look like. An MD5 sum is a simple case scenario. This is what my program looks like. And a summarized string, a simple string. If it looks anything different, it's been tampered with. Therefore, deny the ability to execute. But there's no checks to see if the game was modified. There's no internal code to check if the function ran, if the check actually went through and it said pirated game equals 1. So you could easily just delete that section of code and then the game still runs like normal. No MD5 check, no internal C++ or game maker check for the functions that ran. It's just such a piece of isolated code, it doesn't even matter if it exists or not. That's why this guy does not understand what he's doing. He states that he's a hacker. He's done it for 20 years at Blizzard, doing something with bots. And then he says he's been coding games for 20 something years. If you've been coding games and your code looks like this, and on top your game looks like that pixelated thing we saw earlier, I'm sorry. That's a lot of time wasted on nothing. Like you should be doing way more. Like look at the Schedule 1 guy. I bet you he's probably been doing games for like 3, 4 years now. He put his heart and soul into the Schedule 1 game, and that game came out amazing.
Or tampering with it. We could have just ripped out the entire DRM function and left it empty. We could have found the places the DRM checks were called and removed them instead. Regardless of what we chose,
There you
there's
go.
at least a few dozen working options to pick from. And all of this also applies to the actual Heartbound game, not just to the tiny C++ program I wrote. To be thorough, I'll also cover some application security measures that could be added and some DRM measures. But I'll keep it light and just at a high level overview, since diving into those is way too out of scope for this video. First of all, let's go back to our C++ source code. Something we could add to prevent Ollie debug from opening up our exe would be to add the native Win32 function isDebugger present. Yes, that one line would help stop some of the simplest debuggers from opening the exe. Next, we could also add something called
That's
string
fair.
obfuscation, meaning we don't need stuff like IGG Games or the YAR pirate message and
Right.
easy to search for format. By obfuscating and having a special function to decode the real strings,
Which normally means you put it in an array, you scramble the letters around, and you have a reverse scramble to place it wherever you need to use it. And you just use the function name for that location. That would help obfuscate any specific strings. Otherwise, you're just using a typical variable type with data in it, and you can search it anywhere on any case scenario.
we could have prevented the search string stuff we did in the cracking process. Another simple thing we could do is what's called a checksum. Basically, we can have our own application look at part of itself and generate a special result from that. So in the case if someone tried to crack the application by removing the DRM, the application portion being checked would be different, meaning the checksum generated now would be different from what's expected and as a result would fail.
This is important when you're doing online downloads too. If you're downloading a Linux operating system, there's always an MD5 sum. The MD5 file sum check basically states, hey, we took the original file, we did a quick little sum of everything into an algorithm, and we've condensed this whole 5, 6, 10 gigabytes of data into like maybe 100 or 200 letters and digits. And every time you take the original file and you do an MD5 sum, it looks exactly the same in these 100, 200 digits. And this is useful for when you're downloading and maybe sometimes you're not on a secure network. Sometimes you can find that can be impeded by another actor, a third party in the middle, and they can modify the thing you're downloading with a virus. So you always try to make a MD5 check, make sure that that file is exactly how it's supposed to be from the original source. And if it's modified, it'll say that does not match. And that's exactly what you do with these case scenarios. You can do it within the application itself. You can make a third application on the outside. It's like a security check. And you can basically do an MD5 on the code itself and just make sure that it looks exactly like it did from day one. If it looks different, it means something modified the inside, which means now you should break it and not let anyone use that program anymore. Like a self-destruct, and that's it. But those are just concepts that are way beyond his comprehension, apparently, because all he did was just create some if statements that, if existed or didn't exist, can be modified or can be deleted, and the game still runs without any issue. So, foolproof DRM check? Way far from it.
Fairly common additional layers of defense for programs to help prevent tampering with the distributed program by end users. Alright, with all that, I think we can start wrapping up this DRM analysis. And yes, there's a million more things that could have been done, and yes, there's a ton more application security measures that could be added. There's entire standard bodies around it. I just barely scratched the surface. Also, I'm not a hacker. I don't do this type of work professionally, and I don't mess around with this stuff in my free time either. I'm a complete novice when it comes to this area. But for context, if I didn't stop this video every few seconds to explain what was going on, the first attempt I took at cracking the DRM in total, uninterrupted, would have been 37 seconds altogether. Now, let's return to Jason and see a tweet plus a short where he mentions his assembly and reverse engineering experience.
I'm a hacker. I've been a hacker for 20 years. Part of my job throughout that was working in the games industry. I was one of the guys sitting there pulling down every bot that worked for every MMO that we worked on, everything at Blizzard, grabbed every single one of those, pulled it out into assembly, grabbed the code key from it, removed the polymorphic.
The section is pretty long, so we'll save breaking down the code key.
Remove the polymorphic, what, algorithms? Like, want to fulfill the rest of that statement? I don't believe anything he says. It doesn't. It just the methods in which he's coding, the way he speaks too. He knows a couple of terms that he uses: assembly, polymorphic, code cave, but he's not putting them in a clear way. And not only that, his code is crap. So, like, I'm sorry, but if you didn't think of any of the processes to actually obfuscate your string that can be searched in assembly, then you haven't done enough assembly or disassembly on these bots that you say that you've also said you worked at Blizzard, which is an obvious lie at this point, because then later he states that he hasn't worked at Blizzard. So have you worked at Blizzard or have you not worked at Blizzard? Or for Blizzard versus at? Like, what's the difference? It just seems like so much spaghetti from his statements that his own lie is becoming lost in the sauce.
Cave and polymorphic code comments and nonsense, and his comments to VX Underground for maybe a part 3 video related to his hacking claims. The only part from here we need to care about for now is Jason.
Yeah, I'm seeing this YouTube Twitch game bro says he's been a hacker for 20 years and did anti-cheat stuff at Blizzard. He said he pulled it out into assembly, grabbed the code cave, question mark, the polymorphic, that's the thing, it's an algorithm. It's a polymorphic algorithm that changes the way the code works live so it can basically hide itself from antiviruses. In this case, code cave was the term we used to describe where cheating tools injected themselves into the client for their hook. Memory. You're talking about memory. You're talking about the fact that you can go into memory, readjust the pointer, and then basically hijack a little slot in memory that will point to another slot that you control, and then inject code into that process that's being run. A code cave? I mean, I haven't really heard of code cave. He's just using terms. Like polymorphic code, or algorithm specifically. Polymorphism, yes. I mean, it's just the way he uses
confirmed
words.
to have done reverse engineering and gone through and read assembly, similar to what we did earlier. That was another reason I chose to use C++ and Nolly debug, since those would have been the language and tool he would have been using during his time period at Blizzard or earlier, since those were some common choices back then. Now, while in part 1 I leaned towards distrust, but I gave him the benefit of doubt on a few of his hacking points, I think it's clear to see Jason doesn't seem to know a whole lot on how to create a secure application or how to set up a real custom DRM solution. And while this entire video I've been referring to all this as DRM, it really doesn't deserve to be called as such. I can fairly confidently say day, Jason barely has any application hacking knowledge that you would expect someone to have with his supposed history and experience. So
I
the
agree.
fact he doesn't
20
even seem to
years.
understand any of these
20 years, and he doesn't know how to do an MD5 or a self check or even obfuscate the string that is supposed to identify a pirated version. 20 years and his code still looks like a college student that just graduated. Please tell me how that's possible. No advanced systems within his code at all.
concepts or problems makes me fairly confident saying his reverse engineering and assembly claims are mostly made up stories or complete and outright lies. Let's leave the DRM stuff behind us now and move towards the code reviews.
This is the part I really wanted to go through because we looked through this on the previous stream based on how he coded his next project, Heart something, and it's so messy.
Before I start
It's
doing the reviews
so
themselves, let me
messy.
give some additional context. If you watched part 1, you would know Jason supposedly started doing dev stuff in 2002, meaning at this point in 2025, he has 23 years of experience programming. When he started working on his first game, Champions of Breakfast, he had somewhere around 13 years of experience. So when he started seriously working on Heartbound, he should have been very familiar with
Heartbound.
GameMaker and the GameMaker language. Also, he's the owner of the game studio and the only person who's ever touched the code on the Heartbound game. So I don't want to hear any nonsense like his code's
He's the
bad on
only
purpose for job
developer.
security or someone else wrote the garbage code and he inherited and has to maintain it. Lastly, all the code we're going to look at is modern and should still be in the game, based on what I could find from his live streams. So this is a reflection of his current abilities. I'll be saving all my comments related to Jason's coding abilities for after I finish all the code reviews. Also, let me break down my criteria and rules I set for myself so everyone understands why I chose these code snippets and how I'll be offering advice and comments on them. First off, the code snippet had to be something I had confirmed to be shown on Jason's streams. I had a ton of people sending me code snippets in text over the last few days, so while it might be Jason's code, if I couldn't confirm it, I decided to skip it for the sake of fairness. So every
fair.
code snippet we'll review today is something I could personally verify has been shown on one of his streams and is legitimate Heartbound code. Second off, the code needs to be a reoccurring problem or have significant impact on a large part of the code base. So I won't be reviewing some throwaway script on some small unimportant object, like some random tree object that has an attached script. This I think is kind of pointless to review, so I skip those kind of super low hanging
There's always like
fruits.
small
Third,
tools that we use here and there that eventually we integrate into the main set of code and we forget there's like extra little script somewhere. That's fair. It's just being human. But that's why I kind of go and clean it up and, refactor your code.
unless I absolutely have to, I won't drastically change the code. I'll offer solutions and improvement paths that can be taken to make the current code reach some junior level baseline of quality. Also, I'll limit my advice to things that are possible in the GameMaker language and engine. So design patterns and practices that are possible in other engines or languages, but not easily doable or possible in GameMaker, I'll be skipping. Fourth, I largely won't be talking about performance. We're just trying to get the code to something readable that a real development team could realistically understand and work on. Having performance discussion and talking about entirely different data structures and game design patterns is too far removed from the topics of this video. Plus, the
fair.
Heartbound game is extremely simple, so additional improvements here won't truly matter. Fifth, if I basically covered all the issues another code snippet would have, I won't cover the other similar snippets. Basically, there are like 100 files with the exact same problems and issues, so if I address the issues other code snippets would have during the other snippet reviews, I'll skip over anything too similar so this video isn't stupidly long and repetitive. Yes, there's that many problems with the code base. I felt I needed to add these rules and criteria. With all that out of the way, let's start with some actual code reviews. We'll bring back the DRM snippet and we'll open up a few other snippets as well. If you remember at the start of the video, I talked about truthy and falsy values on the pirated game variable, and I brought up the term
This
bool.
is what irks me. True and false. Stop using 1 and 0. It's easy to identify, it's easy to switch, and it's easy to type because it's 1 character versus 4 for anyone that's too lazy. But true and false are their own data types. They do act on their own types of encoding. Use those instead. They're secure. There's only 2 of them. 0 and 1. There's also a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, a -1, a -2, a 1.5. When you use digits to represent true or false, you're kind of expanding your own set of errors that could happen, either accidentally or through someone disassembling your own freaking code.
Booleans. Booleans are
Just type out true and type out false. Just do it. It's so 4 letters. It helps you. Tirrup. You do a little pattern a couple of times, you can type it without even thinking about it. It's just
basic data type in nearly all programming languages, and you would use the values of true and false directly when you're checking to see if a variable is, well, true or false. So if we look at these code snippets, we can see Jason is using 0 or 1 in numerous places, instead of
all
using
the
the appropriate
time.
data types and values. This is
I don't
a
even
sign
think
of a
I've seen him use true or false anywhere. It's just zeros or ones.
more amateur programmer. I just wanted to clear this up now, so we won't have to repeat this in every single code snippet we look at. Now,
Yeah.
let's drill down into a specific code snippet. We'll start with the one from the bottom left. All right, so the very first line, we already have a lot of issues here. So Jason is accessing a storyline flag in a single dimensional global array using a raw index number of 367. Both of those
So this is what we'll go into detail. We did it last time. A storyline flag is basically a separate location where it keeps track of the timeline in which your story goes. In a case of like a text-based game, you create the logic and code, and then you import the story from a JSON file that just kind of has a structured array with what should happen at step one all the way down to the end of the game, right? And with Mario, like if you played Mario in the back end, that's basically how they organized all the levels from beginning to end. And that's why you can go in that secret hidden pipe and then basically skip different levels because it would just straight up load a different part of that JSON file. And that's how you jump over levels. So a storyline array normally shouldn't be linear because as you write it in a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 way, what if you want to add something between 4 and 5? That means you got to change the old 4 to a 5, make space, put the new 4 in, but then the old 5 into a 6, the old 6 into a 7, the old 7 to an 8. You're basically recoding that whole piece of code just to add a little change you want to make. Completely horrible and time wasting.
those things are terrible, but let me explain what an array is first. Arrays are a basic data structure that stores a collection of elements. Let's go through a quick example. Imagine you have a row of boxes, and inside each box you add a number. To access a number inside a specific box, you would use what's called an index value. In GameMaker, array indexes start at 0. Another nice thing with arrays,
I think all languages, it basically starts at 0. Python, C++, C Sharp, Java, JavaScript, Lua. Every basic array starts at 0, and that kind of creates that off by one error because people are so used to thinking in the 1, 2, 3 way, they don't remember that computers start at 0, and then something goes wrong and there's an error. It's like, why is my loop thinking that it's the end of the loop, but there's also one more space? Oh, because I started counting at 1 and not 0. The off by one error. You'll experience it if you haven't yet.
there are lots of functions built into your programming language, making it much nicer to work with. Arrays are a basic program concept and near universal in all languages. Now, let's deal with the index number 367. This is what we call a magic number. Magic numbers in programming are when you use a number directly to check or access something, and there's no way for someone reading it to have any idea what it could possibly mean or refer to without someone else explaining the intent or finding a different file that might hold the context needed. Jason uses magic numbers across all his files in codebase. So for us to get context on this, let's pull up another code snippet that has the storyline, array comments, and logic. Okay, there's another huge issue with this code snippet too. Something I'll refer to as code change blast radius. To better understand what blast radius is, let's imagine we're looking at lines with indexes of 207 and 208, dealing with something called middle storyline flags. Let's say one day we want to add another storyline flag or event for this section called middle. We have two options here. Option one, we go to the end of this array and add in a completely unrelated area of the array, another middle event. So this array has something like
This is what he's talking about, right? Imagine you have 500 of these and you decide, hey, instead of from floor 2 to the cafe, I want to go from floor 2 to the pool. So now you add another pool at the cafe, 213, but now 213 gets pushed to 214, 214 gets pushed. You have to manually go in and change every single digit all the way down to 500. What kind of work is that? That's just nothing. You're creating more unorganized forms and way more work than you actually have to do.
560 indexes, meaning if we added a new one at the end, our middle event flags would be indexes 207, 208, and 561. This is absolutely terrible since logic and events that should be together are at completely random spots inside the array. This causes a whole host of issues. The code becomes difficult to reason about, the magic numbers become even more challenging to maintain and use. It's so obtuse that the odds of maintaining and using this code decreases the more this array is expanded on. So what's option 2? Well, it would be nicer if it was at line 209. So it's logically grouped together, but in order to do that, we need to bump all the under indexes by 1. So the old 209 would be 210, old 210 would be 211, etc. Unfortunately, this is what we call a nightmare code change or refactor scenario. Since if we wanted to do that, we would have to go by hand and update every single index after 209 within this file. Then we'd have a near 100% code change blast radius. Since if we change those indexes, every other file using those storyline flags is going to need to update their index number by 1.
That's true. It's not just this particular index map of all the events, but every place that you've actually used that piece of code will have to change in all other files as well. That's just so much work that you might as well start the project over and figure out a better way to actually make this work without, which normally just means variabilizing, creating a separate file, JSON file, that pulls information. There's so many ways to do it, but you'll see a kind of a better organized method. Also, guys, like and subscribe if you like this content. I do a lot of programming as well on top of this, vibe coding, all kinds of bits and pieces. If you like these little lessons of nuggets information, do like the video. And if you're not subscribed already, do subscribe. If you are subscribed, much appreciated. I hope to be of help and of enlightenment in the coding environment.
One, if they're at the 209th index or greater. Essentially, the structure is so bad and unwieldy, it's basically impossible to maintain or extend in a good way as it is. Let's deal with the magic numbers first, then we'll discuss a better way to do the story flags. We have two options when it comes to the magic index numbers. We can use const values or enums. Const values are just a named variable.
There. Already. You're basically using values that are constant, right? They're not changeable, but at least they give you something more than just a number. You can value them. You can give them a specific value so you can always go back and check it. And if you create any other number, it doesn't have to be in order from 207 to 208. You can even put it in between. But in the end, all you're using is the keywords to track the events happening. You don't have to worry about the numbers being affected. So you just adjust the actual keywords. That's one case to maintain like an index, a basic index, or you can use a dictionary, or that's what Python calls it. You can use a key value pair where you can actually text a key, a string key, and then adjust it to the value you want it to be. So there's a lot of different ways you can
Variable
do
with a
this.
value that will never change. Enums are a data type that contains its own list of named constants. Enums are a much nicer choice to work with, so we'll go with them. With this enum
Yeah.
defined, we can update the global storyline array where index 207 and 208 are with the enum values. Now, isn't this better? Now we have some context for what the storyline array indexes for. Plus, if we return to our previous code snippet, we could change all these magic numbers into enum values. So 300.
Yes. Case one, case two. Now you can actually throw in specific defined enumerations, variable names basically, and it makes more sense when you read the code. I mean, I guess there is a case for obfuscating your code so much that no one can ever go in and change it or modify it. But then you can't either unless you have a notebook next to you that has every single digit and you can basically look at that back and forth, and that becomes even more unsustainable when your program grows. This is really the case for like a expanding project, something that you maybe have now, a small game, but you want to reuse code for a bigger game in the future. The more you use variables, the easier it is to essentially expand on it. And variables come in a lot of forms, right? Not just a simple single variable. The more you integrate these sort of dynamics to your program, the more you can reuse code for the future. Otherwise, this is basically stuck to this one game and he can't reuse code for his next game. And end of story. It's not reusable.
67 could be an enum.
You can at least use the storyline process. The way that if you create the storyline process in this specific order, you can reuse the storyline and then change the story for the next game. But he can't even do that because all the numbers are hard coded.
Force value, 333 could be an enum value for a town, and the 1 and 2 that is Fern and Road could also use a character enum. Now we have our first code improvement. The storyline flag structure still isn't good, but we've reduced the blast radius of changes from the entire codebase to basically just one file. Since we have a nice abstraction away from the raw index number, we just need to update
This
the
would
enum
be
and the
essentially your JSON file in certain cases. It's just a data file that you basically create your structure of the game, configurations. I mean, you can go all the way back to when I used to play StarCraft 1, the server configurations. I could go into this little config file, I think it was like bnet config or something, and then change that server to a different server, and all of a sudden I'm connected from the US server to the European server with a little configuration. That's what configuration files are for. Modifiable, easy to store, easy to grab, and you don't have to have them so linear.
the storyline array to have new flag options without having to update the rest of the codebase. This also helps with something called developer experience, DX for short. GameMaker includes what we call an IDE, or integrated development environment. Basically, an IDE helps you to code and easily refer to code and values across your codebase. So if we use, let's say, the enum example, and we started typing in middle and then dot, the IDE would show us the values under the middle enum, meaning we don't have to search for the file with the enum to see what values we can use under that specific enum. We also don't get a bunch of random type suggestions that don't apply to this situation. Having good DX is important when working in a team, and I'd argue critical if you're trying to build and program something solo in a reasonable amount of time. So we'll stop worrying about the snippet since it's half decent code quality now and workable. Now, let's return to the global storyline array. While our enum change is a huge improvement over the original state of this file, this still isn't exactly good. Now, before I offer a solution, let's see why Jason used the flat single dimensional array in the first place. So, according to Jason, he has a flat array because he wants all the values to be saved exactly the same way in the game's save file, so players can modify it. Well, his reasoning is kind of dumb. What kind of code structure you have and the save file format you want do not impact each other. Every single game that has a save file has something called serialization, which is the process of taking your
JSON.
game structure and data and converting it into a format your game will know how to read and reassign the values into the correct places. This is serialization and deserialization, respectively, and it's a basic concept when making a save file. This is
Yep.
literally a basic thing nearly every single game has. So, yes, it's perfectly safe to not use the one-dimensional array here. Next, let's look at a save file.
True.
So every line has a random number value that's supposed to correspond to one of his array indexes. Since we know what the problem
Oh, so this is the save file corresponding to the current events that have passed and what has not passed yet. Okay, that makes sense. But still, a save file with this kind of like long list of array, single dimensional array. Horrible, horrible format.
is and what we need to achieve, now let's actually code up a better solution. Let's start by changing the storyline array into a struct. A struct is a composite data type. Basically, it's just a variable that can hold other variables inside itself. Since we
Yeah.
already know Heartbound has 5 chapters, I'll further split up the structs for the 5 chapters to have some separation of concerns. Here we can see what the structs look like. We have at the top level our chapter, then we have our area of that chapter, and finally within the third level we have our storyline event. What's
Yeah.
so nice with
This could be easily convertible to a JSON file, and it would have a much more laid out approach to like mapping it out and seeing what chapter 1 holds, what chapter 5 holds, how the organization works, and easy to add extra details within your chapters and processes.
this approach is, we can
It's so nice. This is so
now
nice.
ditch the enums
It's beautiful.
entirely. We can access the
Absolutely beautiful.
storyline flags like this, for example, chapter 1, dot, middle, dot, Joe sunglasses. Not only is this incredibly clear on what value we're trying to access, but now we also have nearly no code change blast radius if we want to modify a flag or add a new one. The setup also makes it safer if we're working in a team, since now if any changes are made to any of these structs, you wouldn't cause cascading issues to the rest of the flags, as was the case with the raw index usage. While this is nicer to use, this isn't the only benefit. In GameMaker, it's incredibly easy to iterate through a struct. So what we can do for the save game logic is the following. We can take our struct, go through the key value pair, and since we know the depth level, we can nicely format the save file to include the chapter, the section, and the story flags. For example, here we can clearly see which flag is for Joe's sunglasses. Another huge benefit using these key values directly from the struct is, we added some freedom to make refactors and code changes possible. Since we have the struct key inside the save file for the flag, in the future, if we wanted to change our code order of flags or add new ones, the struct of the save file wouldn't matter. We'd still be able to easily read in the right values. I think this is an important thing to care about. Since the game Heartbound is still in early access, the odds of changes occurring to the various parts of the game are high. And with this save file approach, we're basically in the clear to be as wild with our code changes as we want, and still ensure every player that is keeping up with the game updates is never negatively impacted by them.
The problem is if he currently uses the linear format and that's what the save file. This is why sometimes when a game updates to a new version, it says, hey, there's an old save file that doesn't work anymore with the new one. It's because the methods in which they use to actually organize and structure that save file, right? So it's going from the case of linear that Jason was using is going to a more two-dimensional structure type. That would mean the old way that the save file was being read is now going to be different because the logic, algorithm, the loop that's reading these sort of files changed completely within the actual code. So that being said, old files now get thrown away. I believe Project Zomboid had a case scenario for this. 7 Days to Die also had a case scenario. It's a lot of the indies, as they progress and get better and better at developing their game, they improve on the way that their older versions work into a new refactored form, which is great because that's how you learn. You get better at what you do, and you improve on your own processes with new, more advanced ways to think. But if you fight for your old ways of thinking, you're never going to improve your new, better self.
Also, one other minor thing, I threw in the save file or version number at the top, for example. This helps ensure if we're making drastic changes between game versions, you can easily check what version of the save file you have and internally how to update it. Basically, it's just a good practice to ensure players aren't impacted by the behind the scenes work and progress on the game. With this solution done, let's now look at the code comments from the original snippet. With their structure and clarity, we can start cutting out large portions of these comments. We could keep the value conditions since that seems fine. While on the topic of comments, let's pull up some of the other snippets again.
Someone in my previous stream said it very clearly. If you name your variables well, you never have to use comments. You can just look at the code and understand what you're doing. Because again, you can name them anything you want. You can say x equals y divided by p. But what does it mean? But if you take the extra moment to name your variables appropriately, you can make sense of code with just the code that you have without extra comments. It's just the way that you structure your code. And there are some people that will completely butcher their code and make it look like this with zeros and ones and numbers everywhere, and then a crap ton of comments to compensate for the lack of clarity in the code. But then there's others that will actually code this in a much more cleaner way and make more sense of things.
Comment frequency is way too high in Jason's code. Code should be self-documenting. Comments are perfectly fine to add if there's some special conditions or some other oddity surrounding the code usage, but some of these code comments are just worthless. For example, here he comments what the function call is going to do. There's no surrounding code inside the brackets to affect the function, and there's no parameters. If this needs a comment to understand what it's going to do, that means you should be renaming your function, not adding a comment. Also, redundancy like question asked equals 1 and set stuff is just wasting screen space. Maybe Jason was adding this for his live viewers so they would have a reference what he was coding, but leaving this in afterwards I find questionable. Moving on to the next snippet, we have another array to look at, where Jason is manually setting each array element to mostly the same value. First of all, manually setting every single array index for hundreds of arrays is something I've never even seen an amateur developer do. It's also problematic in a few ways. Either the array should be initialized with values directly, then modified by using the right functions, or we should be using a for loop, iterating over the length of an existing array and ensuring every index has a valid value if we're completely modifying it to something else. Let's make our code change first, then I'll break it down. So what I did here was I added what is called the for loop. What this loop is doing is I will start at the 0.
My God, has Pirate Software Jason dude not heard of a for loop? Like honestly, has he not heard of a for loop? Look at how that changed that code. Easy. Easy. Just change your value. Start at 14 or 0 or whatever value. Increase it by 1. Simplify your code, man. Because especially, okay, again, as a developer, when you find yourself typing the same code over and over, just put it in a function. If you see the same set of values or maybe variables, but different numbers, make a for loop to simplify the process. There's ways you can condense your code for less modifications. Super simple. Instead of having to copy and paste and then change each individual value, you have a nice little list and then you can change the increment. You can change it to evens, odds, whatever sort of algorithm process you want. Start at 14, end at 20. Doesn't matter, right? Those are all modifiable in a loop. But when you have it written like that, you're kind of stuck with what you have. That's the thing. If you're repeating code, there's either loops or functions. And then you use those and you just use a function instead of having to constantly copy and paste the same groups of code.
Index of our array, check to see if our current index value is less than the total number of indices in our array. Then it'll execute the lines inside the brackets. In our case, assign a value to the current index. Finally, it will increase our current index number and check the loop conditions again. If the condition is still true, it'll keep executing the code within the brackets until either the condition isn't true or we explicitly break out of the loop. Then after we finish with this loop, we manually assign the 2 special index cases with the angry road voice value. Loops are another basic concept of programming. Now, why is this better? Well, for one thing, if we ever change the size of the array code in the future, this code will still be safe, since the array length index will know the exact right size of the array. Also, not having to write a million lines of redundant code is nice too. Second, this is actually much safer, and it will reduce the likelihood of runtime errors, or what you as a player would know as a game crash. So, what are runtime errors? Let's say we have another place in code trying to use the voice list, and let's say Jason thought he had 27 elements in his voice array instead of 26, and he was once again using his magic numbers to try and access index 27 of the road talk voice list. If we look at the original array,
it'll be array out of bounds, or it'll basically try and go to this 27th location, which will be empty or broken, and then the game cannot continue because it doesn't exist.
List, it only goes up to array index 26. So what happens when you try to access an index that doesn't exist? Well, the game is going to crash. That's what's going to happen. This happens because accessing an array index isn't code GameMaker can verify ahead of time. So what happens is GameMaker will launch the game and execute the code.
Now in JavaScript, Python, it's not going to crash anything. It'll give you an error, but those are scripting on top of an existing system like Chrome or the Python runtime environment. So like that's fine, but when you're dealing with C, C++ compilers, any sort of like low-level language where it goes down to the hardware, in C, and I'm guessing in GameMaker, you can also, maybe, I don't know if GameMaker lets you, but in C, you can allocate parts of RAM to be a specific variable manually. You can tell it how big you want it to be based on what type of integer or variable type that you want it to be, or you can just manually use whatever numbers you want to literally grab a part of RAM, save it for your program, and basically access it as you please. But then the problem is if you grow too far and you actually put more stuff in that RAM, then you know you can store in your application, or your application keeps adding more to the point of the bounds leaving. Now that's a memory leak. So there's this level of C++ programming where it's very, very delicate. you could screw up the whole system. And if you have a memory leak that now goes into the operating system files and removes some critical file by happen chance that the location is next to some Windows files or running Windows files, right, currently on the system, then you will overwrite those files and cause a whole system crash. These are precautions as a developer. I feel like people are losing efficiency when they do programming because we have so much hardware now, so much RAM, so much hard drive space, so much graphics power that we don't care about the efficiency of the factor. And it shows in the code that I see a lot. It shows in Windows. It shows in Windows Vista. It shows in Windows 8. It's so bulky and so inefficient that you look at something like Windows XP, 7, and 10. They look great. They work and look great, especially when you clean it up and you get all that crappy telemetry out of the way. You save yourself like 50, 70% of space and processing because you're basically scraping down all the crap that Windows wants to run in the background. So there's a way you can make an efficient system, but also I feel like people are forgetting the fact that, hey, efficiency is important. Computer science is important. Just because we have almost infinitely growing hardware doesn't mean we should like skimp out on the efficiency of our system. We should be effective in the way we program, delete our variables when we stop using them, clean up memory, and have good housekeeping skills in our program. That's a thing. Housekeeping is a case where you're basically removing things you don't need or they are done being used, functions or variables, whatever. Then you're cleaning up space so that your program takes the least amount of memory, keeps the efficiency going. And Linux, honestly, the system you're seeing right now, guys, right here, Linux with its new, or not even new, but imagine having like the ability to program directly or run Steam on Linux now. It actually works beautifully. It works way better than my Windows machine. So I'm kind of migrating towards Linux lately. Linux does that. There is a huge sense of efficiency within the operating system. It runs way smoother. You have a much cleaner system. It's just beautiful and it takes no space. And this is me running a bunch of stuff in the background, of course. 6 gigs, but open up Windows, it probably has like 10 gigs taking space. So there's a lot of efficiencies. And I think Linux, because it's an open source project with people that care about
Code
efficiency,
up to that point.
it really makes a difference to the function. And you can run it on older computers. That's the important part. But now think it from the perspective of a corporate person. They don't want you to reuse old hardware. They want you to buy the new iPhone. They're going to update your old phone with some new update that's going to slow it down and kill your battery so that they force you to go buy a new device. It's a scheme. It's definitely a scheme. Planned obsolescence. Look it up.
Point. Once it hits the invalid index, the program will crash, since only at that point in time will it know the array index is invalid and there's no data there to access. Using our approach and the array functions, we can guarantee the full length of the array is accounted for and has values. We could also use the array last function too for the last valid index of an array. This doesn't guarantee the right character voice or expression will be used, but I still think it's preferable to have the wrong voice sound activated while the game is playing instead of having the game crashing and the player losing who knows how much time or progress. Again, for loops and default initialization are very beginner level concepts and near universal in all programming languages. Alright, last snippet we're going to look at for this video. Here we have a gigantic switch statement with multiple repeating cases, and the total case amount being like 1,000 cases for one possible branch path. There's a second branch path where there's like another 100 switch cases inside it too. I think Jason might be trolling us with this one. Let's start with a simple improvement for the multiple cases that are
That's
exactly
funny.
the same code. Normally, when you have a constantly
Yeah.
repeating
See,
code, you write
this
a
is
function
it.
and call it.
This is it. How do you not know to take a function that inputs different values? Next step is the same as the next case. Next step. Clear message, whatever that means. Maybe it's not there. You put a zero for it. It doesn't exist. Text skip, 18, no, 1 versus 0. Text fade. You're doing the same thing over and over. Create a function that does it for you and put those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 8, 8. We'll call it 7 because you activate dialog. The 7 lines will go down to a single line. That's it. You just call the function, input the numbers, call it a day. Why do you have to redo the same thing over and over for every single case? It makes your code messy, repetitive, and your file is much bigger. Your actual application becomes bulky, inefficient, and much bigger. So you can do your, you know, gamers, your customers a favor and reduce the amount of file size just by doing something like this.
to reduce code duplication and to reduce the possibility of
A
incorrectly
thousand
copying code and
cases?
introducing bugs into your program. So if we
1,000 cases. He repeats this 1,000 cases. This is just case one and two. There's 1,000 of these. Jesus Christ.
create a function to reduce the amount of repetition we do, there's a lot of benefits. First, it's a lot easier to read and manage the code and the various cases. Second, it reduces
There it is. From left to right. Next step. Skip. Dialog skip. 18-0. Maybe? I think that's what they're showing. Yeah, next step. Next step plus one. Next step switch case one, two, three, four. Dialog skip 18-0. I don't see it on the list. 19-2. But that's what it's kind of doing is taking each one of those specific pieces. Oh, okay, no, he's actually recreating it. Dialog skip. C message, T location, 18-0, 18 for C message, 0 for T location. Next step plus one. Is this his code now
reduces
or
the
what?
possibility of doing something incorrectly, especially when you're doing the same step hundreds of times. Again, better developer experience too. If you have common behaviors in a function, you don't need to manually type out the steps for every common dialog behavior. It also speeds up development. Since Heartbound is a primarily story-driven game, the more of these common functions you have, the faster you can make cutscenes and dialogue scripts. Now, how do we improve the 1000 switch case? Well, I thought about this for a while, and I think the fastest way to improve it is we take it and we throw it in the trash and never look at it again. I generally thought about this for quite a while. There's essentially no improving the structure. For most of these code reviews, I tried to never recommend anything too far removed from the current state of things, but this is generally such horrifically architected code, there's basically no real way to improve it without a complete rewrite of things. Generally,
Yeah.
when working with dialogue or complex cutscenes, you'd be using a lot more things than just the raw strings themselves. An array of dialogue structs for the lines would be a fairly common approach, and we could skim through a quick example. So the struct data is pretty dependent on your game and needs, but a few things are fairly common across most games, like
Like
having
the
the
video
line
for the
itself,
cat.
the character you
Go in
want to
for the
show on
cat.
screen, and a dialogue type. Generally,
my
we'll
cat
have the
Shadow,
event
by the
type
way.
dictate how to proceed. So a more simple example could be something like the following scenario. Here we have the dialogue array filled with structs, and each dialogue line is a struct in itself, and it tells us exactly what kind of dialogue event it is and what choices and actions are possible for it. This reduces our switch statement to a handful of cases depending on how many event types we end up having. Secondly, it provides a very solid and reliable structure for us to use for all the cutscenes and dialogues within the game. Also, variables in GameMaker can point to other scripts. So let's say we needed to do something crazy that requires an escape hatch. Well, that's also incredibly simple, since in GameMaker we can set the value of the dialogue struct to another script and call it with script execute. With this, we have reduced over 1,000 dialogue cases into a handful that are easy to reason about and extend. Since this is a separate example, I'm not going to dive into this anymore. Okay, with all that out of the way, I think we can start closing up the code review, and I can start going over my comments. First off, yes, there's a lot more things wrong with the code I've shown from Jason that I didn't talk about. There were way too many things to nitpick, so I try to limit my comments to the biggest issues. I also try to avoid offering changes or advice that is too far detached from its current structure and setup. That's why I didn't run through multiple solutions. Also, I didn't talk about any actual game design patterns, since that would be another video into itself, and he wasn't actually using any inside his code. Next, during the code reviews, I wasn't explaining any special concepts or anything. All of the Boolean stuff, the for loops, the safe default initialization, using functions with parameters, enums or const stuff, all of that is literally intro level program concepts. There was at no
Yeah.
point in the code reviews where I went
That's what I'm saying. Like his code looks like a high schooler set of code, or not even high schooler, college kid set of code. But he's also right. Like you cannot fix this. You can't just go back and recode this to work. You have to start from the beginning again. Because as soon as you dedicate a specific method to coding your program, you adjusting the way you store your data, the way you go access your data. What are you the way you access your data, the way you go through your loop to hunt down configurations and settings and storyline events and whatever. When you dedicate that code, it's done. The deed is done. You have to either go back and when you change your data structures, go back everywhere to every single location you called your storyline, which is basically all the way through the whole application, and change that too. So you got to do like a control find for like the all of them, everything, the whole global, every single file you created for your application. It's just a headache. If you ever wanted to, and that's kind of the thing, right? I remember in computer science at UCF, you you learn a very important lesson. You can create a program in an hour. That's true. You can just start coding and make a program in an hour. It can be something simple or whatever. But if you don't take the time to take every step to make sure it works step by step by step. You add a line, make sure it works. You add another line, you make sure it works. If that takes extra time, obviously, so it's going to be more than an hour then. But if you just hit the hay and just start typing whatever you think, even if you have like pseudocode, a whole layout of how you want your code to work, you will not only write the code in 1 hour, you're going to end up debugging for another 10 hours. Because now instead of keeping track of one little step at a time, making sure everything works as you take your steps, you're going back. You're going back and trying to do all of the debugging at once. And that's going to take way more time. That's going to take way more time, way more headaches. And most of the time, you just have to start all over again. And you realize your error is the way you handled something that cannot be modified. So it's better to experiment and take a step at a time process when you're coding. Use your prints, use debugs, use whatever methods you need to use to basically make sure your code works before dedicating the next steps forward. Anyway, a lot of little nuggets of information and learning processes here. We go through a lot of languages. You've seen me work with some JavaScript, creating some the vibe coding sessions. We don't do too much analysis on code. We just kind of try to play around and see what kind of simulations we can create. Python, I've done networking based cases where we're using sockets to connect between different devices. So you can see how networking works on a basics level. So a lot of basic starting points, and I'm kind of like basing this chat or this whole process based on the people that come in, right? I get a lot of people asking basic questions. So I'm dedicating myself to beginners based classes. So if you want to keep up with all the beginner sets of sessions that I do, that we go through basics in programming, the first 15% of every programming language can be essentially done and understood very quickly, fairly quickly. And then that helps you understand 20, 30, 40, 50 different types of languages, right? So it doesn't matter because syntax is very similar between C++ and GameMaker. If Pirate Software Jason says there is a difference, he doesn't know languages. The syntax processes are the same. The only differences are the APIs, the extra layers on top. One of the biggest pieces, I don't think I have it here, but one of the biggest pieces you will see in a general sense is that syntax, variables, for loops, logic, all of them, every language has those. You may have to write it a little bit differently, but they have those. The only difference is if you want to go into game development, security, web design, web mechanics, and backend, all of those require different sets of tools. That's the only difference, but that's the 85%. So you don't have to learn all 85%. You just need to learn the first 15 so you can get a good grasp on how to use the language, and then you learn the tools in your space. So he did say that too. Like you learn the tool that you need to use. But the problem is if you never like research on your own, how do you know what tool to use, right? So there's a lot of research to be done. And when we go through our sessions, we use AI. We use Grok. We use built-in AI that we use on the computer. You'll see that I have a little built-in Olama Mistral that I can use. And it's basically running on my graphics card. I teach you how to do that too. A little AI that runs directly on your computer, and you don't have to pay 80 bucks a month to use Grok or ChatGPT or whatever, right? Like in this case, write me a Python server for PHP. Maybe a simple Python, because in this case it's pretty intense. PHP can go pretty far. So we can use Flask. There it is. It knows an actual input that we can use, a framework to adjust, and it shows us the process. You can use AI that's essentially built into your computer to do all of the things you need. You import Flask, you create the app, there's your process. Look how quickly it is that you can set up a local PHP server with Python. And then you can create the document. Now it's actually making my document for me. Like, this is why we got to use AI as a tool to help us expand our abilities. Right. And you don't have to buy AI. You don't. It's like water nowadays. You can, as long as you have a graphics card on your computer, you may have to wait depending on the graphics card. This one right here is an RX 570, probably like 10 years old, if not 11 or 12 years old by now. Um, it's the what was it the Red Devil? Forget the brand. Cooler or something. Regardless, it's an old card that can still run AI locally on my computer and I don't have to buy it, right? And then you can use this as a guide on how to put yourself together and analyze code. The best way I learned is from analyzing code. I want to do a game or I want to do an application. Show me what it looks like. I will take it apart piece by piece. It's called basically surgery. It's called coding surgery. You look at it, you take it apart, you change some stuff, you see how it modifies the details, and you learn as you go. That's the most fun way to do it. And do keep in mind, I have videos on how to install this particular types of stuff, like the AI on your computer. So if you look up on my channel, DeepSeek, there's an example. You can run DeepSeek R1 on your computer. The Olama installation, the commands you can use, all the models you can install. You don't have to install DeepSeek. You can do Mistral, you can do CodeLlama, you can do, I think Claude maybe is available. But if you basically take that, go to this, boom. I did a little weird. All right, all right. I'm a
So
raccoon, trash
today
panda.
I'm gonna basically show you how,
But that's
and
it. You get to
honestly,
basically install your own system, your own AI in your system, and start coding right away. So we use this on a common basis. We use AI as a guidance. We don't use it as a crutch. That's important. I'm a teacher, I'm a math teacher, and I've seen a lot of students use AI as a crutch. Do this problem for me. And then they're like, oh yeah, I remember my AI doing it. I did it before. But you didn't really do it. You just saw the AI do it, and then you copy the answer and you came forward. Careful, careful. That would be a crutch. When you depend on another thing like a calculator to do your math for you, that's a crutch. Same thing can happen with coding. Use these devices as a tool to help you grow. If you're not getting anything from this text, then you're not growing. You're just copying and pasting and really doing yourself a disservice. We are at a great moment of time where instead of having to hunt for information online, we can download a model that's been trained on all data since 2023 and it can basically see anything. How about describe the double slit experiment in physics? Let's see if that's going to do, 'cause that's a pretty big experiment. Basically, you have a textbook device. You have a intelligent device in your computer that you can use to learn anything from physics to mathematics, from programming to all kinds of details. And it's amazing because it's on your computer. You never have to have it touch the internet if you download it and install it on your computer. So, Olama, check out the video. I'm gonna be done from this. This is another video that I made, so you can look it up on Super Scholar Chris MIA. A lot of educational material. Make sure to like and subscribe, guys. I appreciate your watching, and keep on coding. Use the tools to your advantage. Don't let those tools become crutches. Learn physics, learn math, learn programming. Everything can be done through an AI now. So, good luck. Thanks for joining. Like and subscribe once more, and I'll be back later. I gotta do some student stuff.